I'm going to announce our first speaker. So this is Bill Dakin. He is a descendant of Paris Gibson. So he is here to tell you about Gibson's life before and after the founding of Great Falls. So I'm going to let him tell you more about that with his talk. So welcome, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Am I audible? Too audible? Okay. I have to get used to the logistics here. First of all, thank you for even coming. I hope everybody had as fun day yesterday as I did at Fort Benton. The easiest way, I think, to understand my relationship is this 4-generation family. This is Paris Gibson near the end of his life. His son, Theodore, my great-grandfather, my grandfather, Donald Gibson, and his wife, Jewel Lynch. This little urchin didn't know it at the time, but she would give birth to me about 40 years later. That's my mother, 30 years later. The program is just a short excerpt from a longer one I did. It was a result of 2 COVID winters and some handed down family artifacts and help from a lot of other people. The simplest connection is he was my grandpa's grandpa. I got to remember to hold this thing. I think one of the first things that kind of stands out when you look at Gibson's life is how long it was. He lived to be 90 years old. A male born in the United States in 1830 had a life expectancy of 44. If that little boy lived to be 5, that life expectancy jumped clear up to 51. So a 90-year lifespan from that era is pretty remarkable. Here in the city that he found, boy, this is awkward. Stand and I'll try to. I'm sorry.
They are. These structures are not immortal.
Hundreds here in the city he founded, of course, his
since their peak in the mid 20th century.
Oops, interference. Who is that lady? Who's talking?
Technology, closures and removals of railroad lines, and consolidation of operations have led these structures to
something's connected there. Can I overwhelm it and keep talking?
Decay and disrepair.
Yeah. I won't recount the founding. I mean, a little bit of it was touched on this morning in the general session.
Identified over 40 elevators.
And there's
a little closer. That better? Thank you. Our research identified over 40 elevators that were taken down in the last few decades alone. Excited to see we're crushed.
I wonder if they hear me. So this is about his life before and after the city event, which is reviewed so many places. And I think a lot of people in this room probably know more than I do. I know one guy that does. This is a painting by his brother, a watercolor, his brother Augustus of Gibson Place, their family farm on the Saco River near Brownfield, Maine, near the New Hampshire border. He was born here to parents, and both sides of his family went back in New England to the 1640s. He was the 7th of 7 children. His father was a lumberman and a farmer and had been a militia captain in the War of 1812. His mother's last names were Gleason and Howard, and her family, similarly deep-rooted. Her father and grandfather both fought in the Continental Army. Gibson had a head start in life, and he knew it. He was very appreciative. They had a huge library that he was very well read. The family was highly educated. He attended the nearby 4-year Freiburg Academy, which is like a high school. Not a lot of people went to high school in that era. But remarkably, his mother had also graduated from Freiburg Academy. He graduated with honors from Bowdoin in 1852. He got a degree in engineering. He was a contemporary there with Joshua Chamberlain. Joshua Chamberlain would become Lieutenant Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, who commanded the Maine Volunteers at Gettysburg, who defended Little Round Top. They were 1 year apart in academics. Since Paris was the youngest sibling, he really had no prospect of inheriting his father's family business or farm. His father always advised him, go west, new opportunity. After Bowdoin, he began exploring. He visited a sister in Chicago, which had only 3,000 people there in 1855. He saw the activity and the fever, the excitement, and he resolved to come back, that he wanted to continue with this westward expansion. But his father's death called him back to Maine, and he ended up there for 5 more years, helping to run that business and run the farm. He also taught school. Another picture of painting by his brother, and the inscription down here says, where Paris Gibson taught school in the Marston district. So in 1854, he's doing all this, he's teaching school. He also served a term in the Maine legislature. He is as a 25-year-old man, taken in a Chicago studio. And the second visit to Minneapolis, to Chicago, he went farther. He went up to the Twin Cities, to St. Anthony's Falls on the Mississippi River, which is where St. Paul is today. He later wrote in a memoir to his grandchildren how awestruck he was by the immense forests of Minnesota, how they fed these water-powered sawmills, and he resolved that here he was going to build his life. But he had to go back and get married. So he went back, married hometown girl Valeria Sweat. She was a doctor's daughter. She had also gone to high school, gone to Freiburg Academy. It's remarkable. And so this young couple uprooted. She was 9 years younger than he was. They uprooted and settled in the new, by then, state of Minnesota. There were fewer than 3,000 people in what would become the Twin Cities. Settlers there came because of timber. They didn't come because of farming. They came because of timber. This is before the great Chicago and Boston fires. Everything was made out of wood in that era. Minnesota was clear cut in 3 decades. It's just an amazing appetite for wood. And there, this is you can just make out the lettering here, Eastman and Gibson, Cataract Mills, 1859. This is still visible in Minneapolis as a monument. This is where he, with partner William Eastman, built the first flour mill on the Minneapolis side of the river, the Cataract Mill on a bluff. And that bluff would become like the Vatican of flour milling. If you're familiar with Minneapolis, think General Mills, okay? There's a monument plaque there. I won't read the whole thing. Millstone came from the Cataract Flour Mill, built in 59, blah, 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 by Eastman and Gibson. First merchant flour mill in Minneapolis. They could produce 300 barrels of flour a day. They quickly built their own barrel factory. I mean, these guys were pretty sharp. They freighted the flour by wagon and barge and rail to wharves on the Great Lakes. He later wrote that as soon as word came out that there was going to be a flour mill, farmers all around the area started planting wheat, and he remembered that that was a way to get people settled in. The Cataract Mill stood until 1920. Through a series of mergers and buyouts, it became part of Washburn Crosby, and eventually it did become part of what we call General Mills. Minneapolis is very heritage conscious, and they have preserved along their beautiful riverwalk a lot of the ruins of these early mills and the waterworks that ran them. Now, these weren't hydro power, these were mechanical waterworks. Both Eastman and Gibson became very prominent in Minneapolis. We'll just focus on Gibson. He vice president of the Board of Trade. I think that's what Chamber of Commerce was called back in the day. incorporator of the Upper Mississippi Navigation Company, charter mason, vice president of the SPCA, which was a lifelong passion. He helped found the first public library, and he was the president of the first Minnesota Board of Regents. So he was a really well-known guy, very successful. With Washburn and others, he was a founder of the beautiful Lakewood Cemetery that overlooks Lake Calhoun. If there's anyone here, I hope some people are familiar with Minneapolis. He prospered. He became very wealthy. Then in 1862, he and Eastman built the first woolen mill, also on the Minneapolis side, on the bluff, not far from the flour mill. The North Star. Okay, let's pause. 1862, something going on here. Civil War, wool, uniforms, blankets. Probably not a bad idea to go into the wool business, right? Successful, very successful. They sold the flour mill and just focused on wool. North Star became a very prized label for quality and status. In fact, the North Star mill prospered and the brand survives today. This is about 1920, although the brand is now made in Ohio. The original building is long gone, but the last North Star mill, they still keep the sign up on top of it. And it's now, like a lot of these buildings, converted to lofts. People live in it. In all this episode, dealing with shipping logistics, flour, wheat, meets this young Canadian guy, James J. Hill, who is 8 years younger and is a shipping clerk, a levy clerk, dealing with the freight between St. Paul and St. Louis. They develop a business association and actually became very good friends. During these years, well, Valeria and Paris here now would have 4 children in 7 years. Okay? The eldest, Philip, and my great-grandfather, Theodore, would end up living their lives in Montana, employed in his ventures and enterprises. Paris couldn't know that cemetery he had found would be the place where he and Valeria would bury their other 2 children that they lost as toddlers. These are the grave markers out today in your Highland Cemetery, where the 2 lost babies were reburied between the parents. And there's a story there when I Q&A, if you want to talk about it some more. Deaths of children were more common then, okay? But they weren't any less heartbreaking. One of the few surviving physical artifacts that we had of Valeria Gibson was a pencil-scrawled, ripped page out of her diary when little baby Paris died. She wrote, she tucked it in the family Bible, which is why it survived. My baby Paris died this morning at 8:30 after one of the most tedious sufferings I ever knew. Oh, the desolation of this house. So they did know tragedy. They knew losses. Everything wasn't rosy. But some people wonder if she ever got over these children's deaths. Later, Valeria Gibson was often described as in poor health or frail or sometimes even an invalid. 30 years later in Great Falls, she would take her own life at age 61. Nowhere in any of the remembrances of that Paris Gibson made, looking back on his life, that I've found, did he ever mention the deaths of those kids? There was one scholarly biography of Gibson, a master's thesis by a James Hanford in 1952. And he, at that time, was able to interview lots of people who were still alive, who had known Gibson. Gibson, or Hanford, wrote that Paris just threw himself into his business. That was his alternative to get past these heartbreaks. And he studied and he became an expert on wool and on its manufacture. Then there was the Panic of 1873, caused by the bust in the railroad bonds, and you may remember the story at Fort Benton. He wrote, oops, I skipped a page there. Sorry, this sometimes happens. The Panic of 1873 was a big setback for Gibson and Eastman, but it was an opportunity for Hill. That's when he acquired controlling interest in the bankrupt St. Paul and Pacific Railroad. Gibson and Eastman endured losses for 5 years. They went bankrupt in 1878. He looked west again, but he was still into wool. He wanted to go to the source of the wool. In an 1899 interview in the Anaconda Standard, Gibson recalled that in 77, while in Chicago in warehouses looking for choice wool, he came across bags of the finest wool he'd ever seen. And they were from Fort Benton, someplace out in the Montana Territory. And he said, this changed the current of my life, for I resolved to go west again and remake my home where climate and native grass could produce wool of such superb quality. So he was a wool guy, and he must have been eager. I mean, he could have waited for the spring riverboat season, but he gets with his oldest son. They take the train out to Ogden. They take the narrow gauge short line railroad north toward Blackfoot, Idaho. They get on stagecoaches in the middle of the winter. Can you imagine? And bounce their way to Helena and to Fort Benton. And he wrote that at the closing days of 1879, found me on my first sheep ranch on Otter Creek, where it discharges into the Belt River. So if you're local, you might know where that is. The rest of you are saying, where the hell is that? Today, if you drive to Stanford on Highway 87 and you go past the Armington Junction and the way station, I think you just drove over his first ranch. Okay. So he gets to Fort Benton. And this is what a topic. We spent all day yesterday in Fort Benton. It was so exciting. But using his Twin Cities connections, he knows all kinds of people in the Twin Cities. He started a lumber yard, and he supplied, of course, from those Minnesota forests. He hauled ore. He did a lot of miscellaneous jobs, but mostly he speculated in land, is what I can find. He would buy building lots and then turn around and sell them to people like himself. But consider Fort Benton in 1879. I mean, what a good time to come there. It was in its heyday. 3 years after the Little Bighorn, 2 years after Joseph surrenders. Already decimated by smallpox and the Marias Massacre. The Blackfeet the whoop-up trade is destroying the Blackfoot culture. And buffalo are being exterminated. If he'd come 5 years earlier, he wouldn't have found it to be such a calm, capitalist-friendly place. The only railroad was that narrow gauge coming up toward Butte, but it wasn't there yet. He was immersed in the world of Baker and T.C. Power and Johnny Healy and Conrad Brothers. The Mullen Road and Hoop Up Trail had just made Fort Benton into a capitalist's paradise. Opportunists' playground, I guess. The Missouri River was no longer about a long trip down to St. Louis. You just had to get down to the railroad connections at Sioux City and then Yankton and then Bismarck. Commerce going back and forth all the time. So many books. You got to get Ken's book on historic tales of Hoop Up country. 1879, the Gold Rush camps were pretty much towns. Marcus Daly sneaking around on Butte, figuring out what's in that ground. The age of electricity is just not very far off. The fur trade was done, but Benton was in its glory days, almost daily. Hides, whiskey, mine equipment, huge. Look at some of the stuff that's stockpiled here. Fabrics, flour and sugar, livestock, lumber, back bars, pianos. And we learned yesterday it was the place where the Mounties were supplied. There was no other alternative to get stuff up the Hoop Up Trail to the Mounties, even their payroll. It was a rough and tumble place, and the gambling and the bloodiest block on the west. But Gibson had come to grow wool. He started buying sheep and shipping wool. His 16 years in the wool business, he was a connoisseur. He knew what mills wanted, and he knew how to grow it. He knew what breeds produce what grade of wool in what climate and what they ate. He imported merinos from Vermont and later from Idaho. He shipped wool down the river, and he brought lumber and more stock up. And the North Star Mill in Minneapolis was his main buyer for his wool. His son, Theo, would be my great-grandfather, 16 years old, says goodbye to his mommy in Minneapolis and comes up the river by himself to join his dad. Gibson bought, that second year, Gibson bought 3,000 head of merinos somewhere near Dillon. And these two sons, and I'm sure some experienced drivers, they were city-bred boys. They herd the 3,000 sheep up to his ranches outside of Benton. In 2 years, he was a very prominent wool broker, and the growth of his business just surprises you. Within 1 year, he had 3 ranches, 3 sheep ranches out of Benton. In '83, one of the Missouri ferries recorded crossing 23,000 head of his sheep in 1 month. And there were other sheep growers with just as big a herds, just every bit bigger. He'd become the first president of the Montana Wool Growers Association, and he would remain that until he became senator. But he was restless. He wasn't just content with sheep, with wool. And from his ranches, he explored quite broadly around northwest Montana, the central Montana territory, looking, as he put it, for a location for a profitable enterprise. Okay. At Fort Shaw, he sees copies of Lewis and Clark's maps and reports. Minneapolis, waterfalls, industry. Better go check that place out. And each November on horseback, after the wool was shipped, he and Theo would explore the 5 falls, starting at the bottom. They were always turned back by bad weather. It took them 3 trips, 3 different years to really get to the upper falls and find the place. Looking out over the confluence of the Sun River and the Missouri, right where we're sitting today, and says, this place will do. This is a place. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on the founding because it's so well known, but he partners with Hill, his old friend, huge trust in each other. They acquire 12,000 acres of land up and down the river, both sides of all the waterfalls. Let's see. This is him at about that age, at about 50 years old. So he's not a spring chicken, but he's not a relic either. He's pretty energetic. This is an enchanting photo of the Park Hotel that he would build with Herbert Cowan when there was absolutely nothing else there. This is 1888. He platted the city with the wide streets, like we just heard, public school blocks, almost 900 acres of parks, incorporated the water power and town site company with Hill. He and Hill become estranged from Fort Benton and get Cascade County separated off. He has various others that he invests with to build a flour mill, which is called the Cataract. And with Hill, he's probably just a really minor stockholder in the Montana Central Railroad. But when Hill comes out in '84 to see what the hell Gibson is talking about, and the NP is already in Butte, okay? He's been beaten to Butte, but he doesn't want to get left behind. Starts building the Montana Central between Great Falls and Butte, even though the Great Northern Railroad is still, inching its way. It was hung up trying to get right away over the Indian reservations, over Fort Peck. And so I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but he and Hill built the first Black Eagle Dam, and the Park Hotel opened in '88 and timed deliberately for the arrival of Hill's Railroad from the north. They had a huge party, and as they say, people came from miles around. But it's such an odd looking thing there. And here's a little looked up closer at it as it was new, and you see all the little trees he's already got planting. And that was one of his things. This edition that we have in our bags, the special edition of the Montana History Magazine, is fabulous because it deals a lot with Gibson and parks and trees, and more detail than I can do here. And his endless promotion. I mean, he becomes a promoter just like the railroads. Building a city would consume him for years. And in the meantime, the territory would become a state. Gibson at first understood water power to drive machinery, moving water, falling water, the weight of it, the velocity of it, translating that with gears and pulleys into machinery. But hydroelectric power, he's widely read and he keeps up on it. And he knows that hydroelectric power is probably coming. So that was part of the foresight too. And it enabled then the smelter to be located there within a few years. But on the side, by 1893, he and his sons had formed the Paris Gibson Land Company. And they were venturing beyond the town site, beyond what he owned with Hill, beyond the power sites. And they were constantly speculating. I mean, they were just endlessly buying, improving, and selling land. It was hand in hand with the railroads, trying to get people to come and homestead and grow the place. While doing all this, though, his passion had kind of withered for wool, less focus on wool and more about dryland farming. Land grant colleges had, oh my gosh, okay. Land grant colleges, the science of agriculture. He led by example, planted thousands of acres of benchland wheat. And what of Valeria? She was not a frontier woman. She was ranch at Otter Creek, no. Course, Fort Benton, no. She stayed in Minneapolis where she liked the amenities, and because of her health, her brother there was a doctor. She seems to have never come to Great Falls to stay, only in the mid-90s, and they never had a grand home. They lived in a suite of rooms in the Park Hotel, and from that she jumped to her death in 1900. So we don't have much time left now but he did become a senator. It was an accident because the Copper King Clark had been refused his seat. It was open for 2 years. The legislature the Senate had to elect his replacement, 67 votes, I think it was, and Gibson was elected while he was asleep in a hotel room. He had no intention, this doesn't want to advance now. Try it manually. Well, I don't know what happened. He was issues of the day were corporate trusts and Chinese immigration and reclamation, pure food and drug, opening reservation lands to settlement, talk of the Central American Canal. He introduced the bills that would eventually pass to create the Marias and the Sun and the Milk River irrigation projects that we benefit from today. Reforming homestead laws was a big deal, which is very ironic because he and Hill had accumulated that 12,000 acres by, I would say, abusing the homestead laws. At the end of his Senate term, he was 74 years old. He traveled a lot. He was a big vision promoter to the end of his life. He said that Great Falls would become a town of 500,000 people. And the slide I can't show you is a pretty funny cartoon of little boy Great Falls sitting on his lap saying, "Daddy, when will we be able to lick Spokane?" And he's saying, "Soon, my son, soon, soon." They started divesting farmlands in 1909. Hill had been divesting things for years, and that was to Gibson's disappointment because that's the cartoon. Let's see if this works now. They had some kind of sham enterprises. The sons carried on the business. This says oil and gas in every baling. That was baloney. It was a dry hole. It was 3,500 feet deep. He became kind of the town grandfather, and he would write little op-eds advising the city and advising farmers and advocating for better treatment to animals. He outlived Hill, his lifelong partner, and wrote a very touching memorial to him. Even though they'd had disagreements, he outlived Daly. He outlived Eastman, the Conrad brothers. He outlived everybody. I mean, just became a pretty amazing old guy. But he had profited so much in the wool business. So as World War I rages in Europe, he's saying, plant, plant, plant. And people are doing it. And you know how it happened. There were some wet years. Farmers did really well. And then the war was over. And then drought happened. And then eastern and central Montana plunged into a depression. He never lived to see that. He was pretty lucky. He was born at a good time. He died at an opportune time because he didn't see that his dream could never work. He didn't really understand that. Am I done? Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you.